Hello, welcome back to the channel. In today's video, we will talk a little bit more about Agile project management and all the different terminologies that get used between the Agile team members. In our previous video, we actually discussed all the different types of project methodologies, and Agile project management methodology is one of them. If you haven't subscribed yet, remember to do that so that you get notified of all the future videos that get made and put on this channel. Your support means a lot to me. Thank you. My name is Salahuddin Qazi. Let's get started. What we're going to be discussing in this video is in lesson 1 and topic G of the student manual. Consider software to be a product, and every product will have a life cycle, and within this life cycle there'll be several projects, and each project will mature the product further. And generally speaking, every organization will have a vision, and this particular product will fulfill a part of that organizational vision. And hence, if you remember from one of the previous videos, you would have a project vision statement. So what we now understand is that throughout the product life cycle, you'll have multiple projects, and each of that project is called as a release. And we're talking about software projects which typically get managed using Agile project management methodology. One way to understand a software project is to consider a software project to be a bunch of features or functions that need to be fulfilled and delivered from this project. Keep in mind that Agile is an adaptive project management methodology which caters to the changes that may happen throughout the project, and changes happen more frequently in an adaptive project than in a plan-driven project. Speaking of plan-driven project, the way that you manage your plan-driven project is by managing the scope, and that's why it's important that all of the scope is predefined so that you can continue further with the project plans. Now, in Agile project management, we know that changes are constant. So managing the project by controlling the scope or managing the scope may not be an effective technique. The trick to manage the Agile project is that instead of controlling through scope, you control with time. So this is one of the important characteristics of an Agile project. And what then happens is that within a release, you will agree with the client on a fixed duration of a window. This window can be 1 week to 6 weeks in most of the projects. So let's say that the client agrees for a 3-week sprint. And what would happen is, after every 3 weeks, you would make a deliverable to the client, and each deliverable will be additional functions that you have developed within the sprint. To summarize, an Agile project is referred to as a release, and within the life cycle of a product, which is a software, you'll have multiple releases. And within any one project, which is within any one release, you would agree with the client for a sprint duration. And usually a sprint duration is 1 to 6 weeks for most of the projects. And whatever gets agreed with the client, let's say 3 weeks, then your sprint is fixed for the whole project. This is another important point to note, is that whatever is the sprint duration, every sprint will have the same duration. So if 3 weeks is agreed, then every single sprint in the project will be for 3 weeks. So this is actually how Agile projects get managed. And as you're starting to understand now, an Agile project, a software project, is nothing but a bunch of features. And within the release, you would have all the features to be developed. Another concept to understand is about user stories. As a simple example, when you use Microsoft Excel, you may use Microsoft Excel for various purposes, for various reasons. One of the reasons why you might use Excel is to maybe add certain numbers. So this is one user behavior, which is, as a user, I'm using Excel to add certain numbers. So this is one example of a user story. Another reason why, as a user, I would use Excel is maybe to tabulate all the names. So I'm going to use Excel as a tool to prepare a list of names. So this is another example of user story. There are more intricate or complicated user behavior that applies to how Excel sheets get used. So as a software developer, it's important to understand all these user stories, and a collection of a few user stories become one of the features. And any software will have multiple features, and every feature will be built up of different user stories. And in a sense, a user story is the behavior of the end user, which is how will the end user use this particular software. So that behavior, the utilization, the usage of the end user is a user story. Now the question is, how do you decide what to do in any given sprint? Keep in mind, you will have multiple sprints within an Agile project. This is where the concept of prioritization becomes much more relevant. So let's go back to the roadmap. It will be possible to eventually define all the features that have to be fulfilled in the product roadmap. Now that's the whole roadmap, the whole vision of the product from the very beginning all the way to the end of the life cycle of the product. Now, within that life cycle, you may be working on one particular project. With that, we will know all the features that are required to be delivered within this release. Let's bring a term here, which is called as a backlog. So a backlog is everything that's expected out of what you're doing. To state in a simplified manner, backlog is all the work that's required to be done. In this particular case, we're talking about features that are required to be delivered, and each feature will have multiple user stories which reflect different user behaviors. So at a project level, you have what is called as a product backlog. So as a next step, all the features that are required to be delivered within the project will further get distributed within all the sprints. And that's another level of prioritization. That is your iteration level prioritization. One of the tools that gets commonly used for prioritizing features is MOSCO. And MOSCO is the acronym for the must-have features that are required to be developed in the sprint. That's your priority 1. Priority 2 would be your should-have features that are required to be delivered within the same sprint. And if time permits, the priority 3, which is the could have features. And it's always a good practice to specify what will not be covered, and that is your won't have feature. So starting with the highest level of priority is the must have features within the sprint. Then you have should have features, the could have features, and what will not be covered, which is out of scope, is the won't have features. And MOSCO is a very effective tool that can be used to prioritize what features will get done within the sprint and so on. So now we understand that the way you manage an agile project is by taking the project duration and chopping it into small pieces, and each piece is called as a sprint. And usually every sprint within a project is of a fixed duration, and you will use different prioritization techniques to determine what are the features that will get delivered within each of the sprint. And an agile project will have multiple deliverables, which means that by the time you complete one sprint, there's a deliverable that's expected out of that sprint. And each deliverable will have a group of features that you have developed within the sprint. The next step is then to estimate the effort required to develop any user story. And the estimate of effort to complete each task which is required to be done so that a user story gets prepared is called as story points. And there are multiple techniques that you can use to estimate the effort for each task. And again, the estimate of the effort to complete any task of a user story is called as story points. Just to correlate, story point is similar to your duration estimates in a plan-driven project. So you've come to understand that the way you manage an agile project is by breaking it down into sprints, and using prioritization techniques, you will distribute features between each sprint, and there's a deliverable that's expected out of each sprint. So basically managing an agile project happens by managing each sprint individually. With that, let's take a closer look into what happens during any sprint or an iteration, and that is your iteration cycle. So the idea of the sprint planning meeting is to understand and define what features will get done within the sprint. And remember, you'll use story points to determine the effort, and this is how you would be able to determine what all features could be completed within the sprint. And all of that is similar to planning for the sprint, and that normally gets done in what is referred to as a sprint planning meeting. And obviously this is happening very early in every sprint. So you start a sprint with a sprint planning meeting. With that, the team would understand what are all the features that are required to be developed, and on a daily basis, the team meets for a very short duration of time, usually in the morning for about 15 to 30 minutes. And the idea of the daily stand-up meeting is for the teams to share what was the work that got completed yesterday and what is the plan for the work to be done today. The idea of the stand-up meeting is more for providing the updates, and of course, as required, any other additional meeting could be set up to discuss any challenges or issues that the team is facing. So that is what is a daily stand-up meeting, meant to be brief. And the idea is for each team member to give quick updates with what is happening with their work. And the daily stand-up meetings will continue for the duration of the sprint. Remember, sprints are usually of a short duration, Most of the projects have a sprint of 1 to 6 weeks. And once the sprint is completed, this is where you sit down with the client or the customer, and this meeting is referred to as the sprint review meeting. And the idea of the sprint review meeting is to better align with the customer, collect any feedback that the customer may have. This will also give you an opportunity to showcase or demonstrate or to provide a demo to the customer with what has been done, what has been developed so far. And any feedback that the customer provides can then be incorporated in the upcoming sprints. And the project manager can use the sprint review meeting to ensure that there's complete alignment between what the customer expectations are and what they're getting at the end of each sprint. And by having that alignment made at the end of each sprint, it allows for any correction that's required to be made or any changes that are required to be incorporated, which can be based on the feedback that's received from the customer or the client. So the sprint review meeting is usually happening at the end of each sprint. And at that time, another type of meeting that can happen with the team is the sprint retrospective. And the idea of the sprint retrospective is more to internally understand from the team what could have been better, what went wrong, and how can we avoid that issue from happening again. And if anything went wrong, what can be the lessons learned out of it. And this is how you can incorporate the concept of continuous improvement throughout the whole Agile project. And that is referred to as sprint retrospective, where you're collecting feedback from the internal teams, trying to make things better, applying continuous improvement. And this is how lessons learned get documented within the Agile project. So those were the few things that I wanted to cover with you in this video. I hope that this video made some terms clear to you. And with that, we'll continue with our storyboard. And the topic for the next video is to talk about project scope management. And if you like this video or if you learned something new, please remember to subscribe because your support means a lot to me. So until I see you in the next video, bye.